Hi, my name is Andrea Peña-Vasquez, and this is October 2nd, 2017. We're in the Julian Samora Library at the University of Notre Dame. And for the purpose of this record, could you please state your full name, place, and date of birth, and where you live now?
My name is Elizabeth Acevedo. I was born and raised in New York City. You need my birthday too?
If you'd like to share.
I was born February 15th, 1988, and I currently live in Washington, D.C.
Okay. That's an Aquarius?
I'm an Aquarius.
Capricorn. Very close. All right, so you've published one poetry collection. It's a chapbook. It's really great. It's called Beast Girl and Other Origin Myths. You're also the recipient of the Yes Yes 2016 chapbook competition. And now HarperCollins is publishing your first novel, young adult novel. First of all, thank you for your participation in this oral history project. And just to begin, can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and your family, kind of your background, where you come from?
Yeah. I was born and raised in New York City. Harlem adjacent is what I like to call it. I think at one point in time it was probably called Harlem. It is really close to Columbia University, and so that has a big effect on the community and how the names change and how the neighborhood has changed over time. The neighborhood block area that I was from was predominantly Black and Latino, very Caribbean, people from all over the Caribbean. And then, you go 1-2 avenues and it's Riverside Drive, and it's all Columbia professors, and it's a different socioeconomic class. And so grew up in a space that was very stratified, and it was very clear, like Broadway is those people, Amsterdam is this people, right, our people. And so although it's New York City and this huge melting pot, I did kind of grow up with an understanding of difference and of haves and have-nots. And yet it was a really beautiful childhood. It was one filled with playing sports in the streets and opening up fire hydrants for sprinklers, and it was very rich culturally. Everyone had their flags, and we would kind of celebrate that and bring that for block parties, and I had a good childhood. Yeah, a lot of libraries nearby, so I got to read a lot.
Nice. Do you have any siblings?
I have 2 older brothers.
Okay. And do they influence your work, or have they read your work?
Yeah. My work is very rooted in hip hop, particularly the work that I began performing with comes from hip hop. I wanted to be a rapper, and that's very much my brother's influence. My parents would play bolero, which is like old Spanish torch songs, at night every Friday. And so we would listen to these kinds of really melodious, heartbreaking songs, and on the low, when they went to sleep, my brothers would play hip hop, right? And so I grew up with a musical influence, but had this tradition of language and of telling stories through this kind of secreted form that was my brothers. And they were very good about reading my work when I was really young, taking me to poetry slams, allowing me the space to explore what I could do within music. It made it seem possible, and I don't think without music I would have arrived to where I am now in terms of poetry, because they affirmed very early what you have to say sounds like it's accurate, you are getting our experience, and they never said you're too young to say this. And so I think them affirming I was a writer very young helped me get here now.
It sounds a little bit like your kind of what you mentioned before about your book, The Poet X, that's coming out. That's very much seems like it's based off of your experience.
Yeah, I think that I've spent a lot of time trying to empower young people and young people's voices. I think it's important to let young people know that their voice does matter and their opinions matter. And it forces us to kind of stay in tune with the times. So often I think adults, we can just become rooted in what our beliefs are. And all of a sudden when you're confronted with someone you may have helped raise, or someone who you know really well, but you've always thought of as a kid, and they have this idea that seems radical, you have to think about, well, maybe there's something there. I can't just keep telling myself the same story. Maybe there's a new story for me to hear. And so I think because I was told that when I was young, like you're saying, something we think is important, I try to, kind of instill that in young people too, and just make sure I'm listening as much as I'm talking.
Yeah, that's very good. So you mentioned that you're kind of exposed to poetry based off of music and hip hop. Do you remember kind of what your first poem was?
Maybe. So I wanted to be a singer.
Okay.
Right, so I wrote songs, and I'm 9, right? So they weren't particularly good songs. But there's 2 little ones I remember, and I don't know which one came first to answer your question. So one was 2nd grade, and I remember it was near Valentine's Day, and so I wrote this piece. Y yo era freca, because this is like a very like love poem, and I'm like, I didn't have no boyfriend. I don't know who this poem was for, but it was, or this song. This day is Valentine's, where hearts and souls combine. You make me feel so special, as if I were a treasure. Chocolate and roses, baby. All I know is I love you. I don't know who this was for. But that was probably one of the first times that I wrote a thing and read it in class. And, my teachers had me present it.
Wow. Was it well received?
I think so. They had me do it at like this gala they would do every year. I feel like if my mom had known I was walking around singing about all I know is I love you, baby, she would have been like, pause button. But that's probably one of the earliest memories I have of not only writing and creating, but also then pushing it towards an audience, having someone listen to my work.
Was poetry, because, you talk a lot about stories, like that your dad has jokes, your mom's stories like live on, and what were they kind of like a family affair, or like that you would all share stories together, or were they more like you would ask and then they would tell you kind of thing?
I think it was spontaneous. My father just has jokes, right? He'll just go to the barbershop and come back with 15 new jokes that he wants to perform and recite, and you never know when you're gonna get one.
They
and
good?
They are not dad jokes. They're very inappropriate. So yes, they're good. They're funny, but you're always like, ooh, that's edgy. But it was spontaneous. It's just who he was. And so I don't think it was like there is a time for storytelling. There is a time where we do this thing. It was just at any point someone might have this thing they wanted to say. With my mother, it was different. My mom loves telling stories. That's how she like proves any point. She tells you, well, 35 years ago. But for her, I would ask her to tell me about her childhood, to tell me about being raised where she was raised. And I wanted a connection to place, and specifically to where she was from. And so she would kind of delve into stories, and they would lead to other stories,
Could you read one of your stories?
Oh, sure. I'll actually read one thinking a little bit about my mom. The Dominican Republic was under a dictatorship for many years, over 20 years, by Rafael Trujillo. And he was known for one of the deadliest massacres of Haitian peoples. The figures go anywhere from 10 to 20,000 Haitians were killed on the island. And people were incredibly afraid of speaking out against it. And this is all things I've learned from my mother. Like my mother would talk about this. She was very young at the time, but they were afraid to speak out. And one of the ways that they would create fear, that the dictatorship would create fear, is they would tell people that they had witches that were employed by the dictator, and the witches would sit on top of your house.
Oh, wow.
And if you talked bad about him, they would send the police to come get you, and they were always listening. So, I mean, it's a fear tactic we see all over, but this idea of who's listening. And I've been fascinated by witches my whole life, right? Maybe it's the Harry Potter influence, but to me it was like, this is our equivalent of like this secret police force that has magic, and what happened to those witches? Like once a dictatorship is over, how do they go back into society and are now regular?
Among us.
so this poem is thinking about my mother's stories, like we just talked about, and that particular story of, these espionage witches. The Dictator's Brujas, or Why I Didn't Grow Up with Disney. I took her stories as firsthand when mommy told me how Brujas were the dictator's favorite spies, how he, Trujillo, would command they squat. She imitated their sitting with one hand cupped in the other, stooped like fat crows, their ears pressed to the zinc rooftops, their one magic eye able to see through the metal and minerals and account for the rebels in the salons below. Insurgency or simple insult resulted in the same, being disappeared. And in that same cupped hand, mommy held me too, imagining an island where there was such a thing as magical espionage. This shit was not Manhattan and no Cinderella brujeria. After mommy thought I was asleep, I wondered about the brujas. What did they do when Trujillo was assassinated? Did they yellow and wilt like plantain leaves? Was their work for him merely forced labor, and now free they could go back to making jengibre bombs and setting bones and lighting fat candles for our dead? Was the bad press too much? Crows shot in the hundreds for being thought witch-like? Did the brujas go underground, take on normal jobs selling boletos and eggs at the local colmado and braiding hair for the tourist beaches? Did they return to their families, apply for visas, or climb onto a seaweed-covered yola, embarking for a city of honey where they could forget the winged words that went drifted up to their ears, that made them heavy and rush-filled with blood?
It's really interesting. Yeah, I read that poem and I knew a little bit about the history, but I think in context it definitely, I can understand the thought process behind it. That was great. So yeah, like you're obviously proud daughter of Dominican immigrants, and Spanish is present in a lot of your work. And I was wondering kind of how were the language dynamics like in your family growing up? Like, did your parents like learn English quickly, or did you have to, a lot of immigrant children have to serve as translators? Like, was that your experience?
Yeah. My first language is Spanish, and my parents have lived in this country now close to 40 years, and have actively resisted, I think, learning English. And have just lived in situations where they really didn't have to. My father was an accountant in the Dominican Republic. My mother had 3 years of accounting as well. And when they came here, it was just so difficult with a young family to take English courses and also their jobs as laborers. My father worked in an envelope factory for 25 years, would get up at 5 a.m. every day, got home at 5. My mother worked as a child care provider. And so she would have kids in the house from 7 a.m. until 6 p.m. And I think for them it got difficult to keep up with their English classes in order to get the recertifications they needed to get the jobs they had back home. And so they created these insular worlds where everyone in my father's factory was from another country, many of whom spoke Spanish, and so they didn't need English. And my mother worked in the house in a neighborhood that was very Spanish speaking, and so again, just they knew the words they needed. And to this day, if you ask them if they speak English, they're like, yo me defiendo, right? Like, I'll defend myself. Like, if someone's talking about me, I'll know. But very early on, I was the one and my brothers who were pushed to wield English. And I think as I kept going through school, and particularly as someone who was grappling with poetry and with language, they realized, you wield that good English, that there was now currency in the way I spoke and what I could say, and you can convince the telemarketers, you can convince the credit card companies, you can convince the landlord of what we need, right? You can be like the lawyer for us. And it's an interesting thing to give language power in that way, to have your parents rely on you for things like that. And I resisted it. I think I hated not being the kid. And like all of a sudden having to be the one that
responsibility.
And really was really angry when they would ask me to translate for them. I hated seeing them vulnerable. And it was hard for me to feel like, you know, other kids' parents don't require this of them. They can defend themselves, right? I think for me, there's a little bit of shame in how angry I would get. And maybe that's part of like thinking of language in Spanish and what do we say and don't we say, and how do we use it to defend and to love.
Because I mean, some of your poetry has, you know, Spanish words in them, and you kind of move kind of seamlessly between the two. Has it always been kind of like important to you to include Spanish in your work, or is it just something that kind of happens naturally and then you let it be?
I think it just happens naturally. I don't think in Spanish. I don't read a lot of Spanish work. I'll actively listen to Spanish music. I talk to my parents every day, and that's always in Spanish. And so sometimes there's just a word that does not have a translation, or I'll write it in English and realize I translated myself, but that word, I know it and remember it in Spanish, and so that's more precise to what I'm trying to say here. But no, I don't worry over much in regards to, is there too much Spanish or is this clear? I just, it is the most accurate depiction of what I'm trying to say, and hopefully people will do the work to figure that out.
Yeah. Do you think that your poetry has changed over time? Like from, I mean, not from like your childhood, but like from when you started.
I hope so.
From like when you started writing kind of professionally to now, like, do you still touch upon the same themes? Do you kind of use the same kind of methods? Like,
I think writing is a sort of obsession. And with any obsession, I after a certain point, it's like you exercise it out of you and you move on to your next obsession. I think it's what makes a collection of poetry vibrate, is that all of these pieces are in conversation, and why the next one might be moving on to something else. That doesn't mean there's not threads that move beyond certain pieces of work, but just that the reason something is collected is because these are of the same, right? And the next collection is of that same thought process. And so even this book, when I was writing it, I was breathing mythology, and particularly Caribbean folklore, and was thinking about the positioning of Caribbean stories and mythologies and folklore within, you know, girlhood. I don't think I'm necessarily in that same place. That doesn't mean my work now isn't touching on some of those things, but I'm not necessarily as mindful of mythology in this moment. And so I think work moves on, and the way you would think about it or see that work also changes.
So I guess I'm curious as to how does your work come to you? Like, do you feel like passionately about a certain topic and then say, I want to write a poem about this? Or does it kind of just come to you in the sense that you then figure out like, oh, this is what this poem is trying to say?
I think it helps me to answer this question thinking about the poem as like place, like the poem as a house. Deena Smith, who's an amazing poet from Minnesota, has this saying that I saw in an interview recently. You know, there are many keys to unlock a poem. Okay. And it helps me to know, like, sometimes that key is music, and I'll hear a song and I have this piece I didn't know I had inside of me come out. Sometimes you're kind of picking away at an idea and you write one line now and another line later, and maybe 4 years from now you're like, oh, all of these lines are the poem. Yeah. And so I think every poem requires something different and wants something different from you, and is teaching you how to write it. And so there are many ways that it can come to you.
Yeah. What kind of advice do you give your students, like in terms of, you know, writing, I think not just writing poetry, but especially writing poetry that's kind of socially conscious and that deals with contemporary issues? Like, do you have any advice for them?
I think I tell people, I once had a professor tell me that rats weren't noble enough creatures for a poem. and he was really thinking more of the symbolism of certain animals and how symbolism can, you know, reverberate in a piece. But there was something about that moment that really struck me. This idea that we should be aspiring to write towards nobility, not just nobly, but towards nobility. And so I often tell students, write your rats. Like write the thing you've been told isn't for the canon, isn't for literature, doesn't belong there, but that fully reflects who you are, because I think those are the stories we're most interested in reading. We don't want the same thing, right? We want the stories. I want the stories we've been told aren't noble or don't reflect, you know, this canonical work.
Shifting gears a little bit, I'm curious, like, have you always identified as like Afro-Latina, or like can you talk a little bit about your Afro-Latinidad and what it means to you?
Yeah, I mean, Afro-Latinidad is an umbrella term I've been thinking about for a long time. And there are many different ways that I've seen folks kind of manifest or think about their blackness. And in some ways there are Afro-Latinas and Afro-Latinos who their entire lives knew they were black because they passed for black, or passed for black Americans, and people would wonder, well, why is your last name Spanish? Or why do you speak Spanish? Yeah. And that's an Afro-Latinidad that I think gets pushed to the wayside often. The one we most commonly hear is the one that's my own, which is like this discovery of blackness. I always knew I was Latina. I always knew I was Dominican, and it took me such a long time to realize that the pieces of myself that were erased had to do with my Africanness, and to want to reclaim that. And so it's been a term that I've been using probably for the last maybe 5 or 6 years, really as a way to not erase anymore, right? The ancestors who so often have been pushed out of the narrative of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and of Latin America. And to say, like, I honor the people I come from.
That's great. I think that's very similar to my experience, and I think that your work, like, not only shows that, but I think it connects with people on that level a lot, like reclaiming their Afro-Latinidad. I wanted to ask you, what do you think makes a good poem? Like, when you read something, you're like, oh, this is a really good poem. Like, what do you think makes that?
I think it's, uber subjective. For me, there's a part of me that is always looking to be delighted by language. I want language that feels like it took a turn I didn't know it was going to take. I want metaphors that feel true to the experience of the poem, but also completely surprise me. I want to be delighted even if the poem is dark or sad, that there is beauty in the writing of it, and in the form of it, and in the way the writer matched content to craft. And I think those things to me show a thought process that says this is a true thing. Even if it's not a real thing, even if we're talking about superstitions or magic or a fictionalized version of something, but the feeling here is true. And look at how it all adds up to a truth, even in the language. There couldn't have been any other word but that one to express what's happening here. And that feeling of inevitability, I think, is one I think makes like the perfect piece.
Okay, so you've written a lot of poetry, and now you're moving kind of into you've written this young adult novel, and do you kind of think that that's the direction that you're going to take, or do you plan on writing more poetry? Like, can you talk a bit about the future? Like, what does the future hold for you?
I think there's a lot of possibility for what is next. Right now, I'm really interested in writing fiction, and in particular writing fiction for young people. And my deal with HarperCollins was a 2-book deal, so there's another young adult novel that will be coming up. And I really enjoy writing these stories and writing for this demographic and then going into schools and talking to these students. And so I'd be okay with having this be the work that I'm doing. But I just want to tell stories. And so ultimately, that may move me in many different directions. I just want to get the story told.
Okay. Could you tell us another story?
Sure. I will.
You have a great reading voice.
Oh, thank you. I think I'll read the poem about rats, being as we talked about that a little bit. And this poem is different when I'm performing it, but I'm going to read it as it's written here. Okay. So there will be record of the non-performance version. For the poet who told me rats aren't noble enough creatures for a poem. Because you are not the admired nightingale. Because you are not the noble doe. Because you are not the blackbird, picturesque ermine, armadillo, or bat. They have been written and I don't know their song the way I know you're scuttling between walls. The scent of your collapsed corpse bloating beneath floorboards. Your frantic squeals as you wrestle your own fur from glue traps. Because in July of 97, you birthed a legion on 109th, swarmed from behind the dumpsters, made our streets infamous for something other than crack. We nicknamed you Cat Killer, raced with you through open hydrants, screeched like you when Siete blasted aluminum bat into your brethren's skull. The sound slapped down dominoes. You rained that summer rap, knocked down the viejos Heinekens, your screech erupting with the cry of Capicu. And even when they sent exterminators, set flame to garbage, half dead and on fire, you pushed on. Because you may be an inelegant, simple, a mammal bottom feeder, always fucking famished little ugly thing that feasts on what crumbs fall from the corner of our mouths, but you live uncuddled, uncoddled, can't be bought at Petco and fed to fat snakes because you are not the maze rat of labs, pale, pretty-eyed, trained. You raise yourself, sharp-fanged, clawed-scarred, patched dark because of this alone. They should love you. So when they tell you to crawl home, take your gutter, your dirt coat, your underbelly that scrapes against street, concrete, squeak, and filth this page, rat.
I don't think rats have ever been paid that kind of homage before. Yeah, I think I wanted to also ask you about what do you think of interpretation and how would you want your works to be interpreted?
In what regard?
So you base a lot of your work on folklore and on, stories from the Dominican Republic. And so what is your intention in terms of people that don't necessarily share that background? Like, is the impetus for them to then research and to learn more about Dominican folklore?
I get this question of functionality after the poem is done, or what is the utility of the poem once I put it onto the world? And I don't know that I give this much thought. The poem is a thing. I don't know that I want to dictate or even wonder what people do with it once it's there, right? That it's not like a basketball, which is very clearly, once it's created, has a purpose of what you should do with it. I don't know. I think people find themselves to the work for different reasons, and they find different things in the work, and what moves them may require research, may not, may require introspection, may not. I have no idea once it's out what it should do, or even what I want it to do. I want to connect with people, and I want to tell honest stories. What people do with that is sounds like their business. Yeah. If I've done my job, then that comes across.
Okay. What's a question that you wish you were asked? Or something that you wish that people knew about you that they don't necessarily know.
Yeah. I love key lime pie. I like when people ask me about food. I love food questions. And I wish people asked me more about joy. I feel like it's really easy for me to deal with things that are historically filled with trauma and anguish, because that's the kind of history that we come from when you come from something colonized, when you come from a neighborhood like the one I grew up in, right? And so it's easy to just dwell in that and to write things about that. And it's easy to feel really hopeless in this day and age. I think every day there's a new tragedy. There's a new way in which you are subsumed by images of death. And those images are so often feel like they're really close to home. And so I want to talk more about joy and hope, and how do we as people cultivate both of those when it feels like the world is ending.
Yeah. Well, we only have time for one more question, but I guess the question would be, like, what brings you joy?
That was well played there. You did good on that one. Key lime pie is just so good. No, I think food is so comforting, right? It's an easy way to like get a quick fix of joy. I love reading. I read a lot of romance novels, which people often are like, but you're so
educated.
Not even educated, just like you deal with so much heaviness and you write literary work. And I just think there's something familiar about these stories that always end happily. Mm-hmm. And I think about it almost as poetry as like a form. Yeah. How do these writers fulfill a form but still tell a different story? There's something there that I think can be studied. And I just think reminders that like love should always be the work. It should always be the work we're doing.
Great. Well, thank you so much
once
again.
Thank you. It was great, Andrea. Thank you so much.